Hi, everyone. I hope that you have been enjoying the podcast episodes and that the episodes have been helpful for your own work. Today, you have an opportunity to hear from someone who's on the other side of teaching, namely a student. This student is a recent graduate of our program and really maximized the opportunities available to her to learn about faith, learn about psychological well being, as well as the integration of DEI topics into those themes. So I hope that you'll enjoy and that you'll continue to reflect on how your teaching impacts our students to make a difference in this world.
Welcome to the Cross Cultural Psych podcast with Professor Paul Youngbin Kim. This podcast features conversations on the intersection of psychology, culture, and faith with renowned scholars in psychology and related fields. And now, here's Dr. Paul Youngbin Kim.
Thank you, Marcella, for being online with me. And I'm really excited to talk with you about your research experiences and also particularly the study that you did. And if I could just name the study right away so that we know what we're talking about. As a independent research student, your study that you conducted was titled Emotion, Religious Coping, Stigma, and Help-Seeking Attitudes Among Asian Americans. Examination of Moderated Mediation. I know that's a lengthy title, but an accurate title of what you worked on. I'm curious if we could begin with a brief summary of that study.
So with this study, we looked at how self-stigma could mediate the relationship between close other stigma and then help-seeking attitudes. And then within that association, we looked at three variables that were the moderated mediators. And so those were emotion regulation, emotion socialization, and then religious coping. And specifically, we looked at all these variables in a sample of Asian American college students, specifically at a Christian institution in the Pacific Northwest. First, we found that the simple mediation, so the close other stigma, self-stigma to help-seeking attitudes, that was significant in our study. And then we found religious coping, specifically positive religious coping, as a significant moderator in that relationship that I just described. And then, unfortunately, emotion regulation and emotion socialization are not significant moderators. And so what that significant religious coping finding means is that for participants who had high levels of religious coping, that weaken the relationship between stigma, specifically internalized stigma or self-stigma, in relation to help-seeking attitudes.
Great. Thank you for that overview. And like you said, some findings just don't pan out, right?
Yeah.
Like you would like everything to be significant, but not all did. But some questions were answered, which is great. Let's talk a little bit more about how you went about conceptualizing the study or designing the study. I think it's really impressive that you, as an undergrad student, was able to design a study from scratch. But it must have been really daunting at first to do that. So curious how you went about that process.
Yeah, so beginning this process, I posed, I think, a couple different study ideas, and this was one of them. My kind of reasoning and like inspiration behind this one was from like my personal experience growing up in an Asian American household where I feel like emotions weren't really expressed very
Mm.
much. I just found that interesting and could see like patterns generationally with how that can influence like mental health stigma, both from like one's close family members and also like internalized stigma. And so I was curious how that would relate to help-seeking attitudes, since stigma and help-seeking attitudes are like common variables that we look at in the Kim lab. And so I thought that could be an interesting way to kind of bring in some new variables to some variables that we had kind of looked at previously or other students and Dr. Kim had looked at previously. So it just started with kind of, that personal experience, and then I came up with a research question. So my research question was, how can emotion socialization practices, specifically from parents in Asian American households or like that sort of family context, how can that influence Asian American mental health stigma, and then help seeking attitudes. So that is the research question that I kind of took that and then built everything off of. And yeah, it kind of, again, with the emotion variables, that is something I've always been interested in. I feel like it aligns really well with my developmental psychology concentration. So being able to kind of draw that background has been really cool to do.
Yeah. I love the fact that you were able to connect your personal experiences with the research interests, including the research interests that are already happening within the Kim lab. So I think when those things come together, really cool to be able to do that. So thank you, Marcella, for those thoughts. What was the most exciting thing about the study? And here you can talk about anything regarding the
Yeah.
study, but for you, what was the part that excited you the most?
I think the most exciting thing for me was just the idea that it was kind of my own project and that, I came up with these ideas and they are things that I have learned in class and I'm really passionate about. And like I said, I've been able to kind of see those play
Mm,
out in my life. So I feel like it's a really fitting way to be able to, spend my last year of undergrad kind of working on a project that I'm really interested and really passionate about.
mm,
And then kind of going from conceptualization all the way through to writing up the study and submitting it for publication. That kind of, I think, was the most exciting thing for me, just it being my own study. And then, of course, all of the the opportunities that came with that, like being able to present it at the psychology research conference on campus. So I know that is kind of like a lot of answers all in one, but really the whole thing has been really exciting for me and a great way to kind of conclude my undergraduate career at SPU.
yeah. I think the timing really worked out well for you, Marcella. And it's not just about the timing, of course, right? Your dedication, the couple of years that you're part of the research team allowed you to have like a project from the beginning until the end, right? And
Yeah.
to be able to also present it at various locations and to also write it up. I think all of those aspects I really appreciated. So thanks, Marcella.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the flip side, which is what were some things that were not so fun about the study, meaning
Yeah.
really challenging or difficult as you were doing the study?
Yeah, so I kind of took the lead on writing
Mm,
the emotion variables in the paper. So I found that to be one of the most difficult things in terms of writing up the study, specifically with that introduction
mm,
and a little bit of the discussion. But what I found when I was doing kind of like a literature search on both emotion socialization and emotion regulation, there wasn't a lot of research that specifically connected both of those emotion variables with help seeking attitudes and
mm,
also not very much literature connecting them to stigma. So when I wrote the introduction, it kind of took a lot of brain work and a lot of thinking to kind of be able to connect not just the two variables, but all three of them together. Also with the other variables, two types of stigma, religious coping. So kind of to be able to explain how those connect and what we were hypothesizing would make sense, even though there wasn't a lot of research on that.
yeah.
So for emotion regulation, for example, something
Mhm,
that I had to do instead of using that specific term, emotion regulation, I drew from literature that was talking about emotion competence, emotion
mm,
awareness,
mm,
studies that had shown that those two variables were associated with positive help seeking attitudes, but just not emotion regulation specific. Being able to draw from other sources and kind of differentiate that in the introduction and say, we didn't see any literature between this specific emotion regulation variable that we're looking at. There are other studies to support, similar ideas to back up kind of what we're hypothesizing.
yeah. As you're saying that, Marcella, I feel like one word that comes to mind is persistence. That just because you can't find, for example, enough literature on emotion regulation to not give up, right? But instead to find other related terms or phrases that might work better, right? And yeah, I agree with you. The introduction is typically the hardest part of the paper, but also the most rewarding in the sense that once it's complete, it feels like, oh, now the easier parts are remaining,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
You mentioned variables, and in our lab, we measure typically variables using instruments or surveys or questionnaires. I'm curious because, students often are searching or seeking for measures to use for their studies. What was an example of one instrument or measure that you use in your study?
Yeah, so one measure we looked at to measure emotion socialization was the emotions as a child, specifically the youth report
Mm,
by Magai and O'Neill, and that was developed in 1997. So, like I said, we use this one to measure emotion socialization. And there are actually different types of this emotion as a child. There's the youth report, the one we used, and then there's also the parent report.
mm,
So the one that we use specifically assesses the individual's perception of how their parents practiced emotion socialization for various emotions. We thought it was important to use this one since we were looking at college students, and on this measure kind of reflected on their upbringing and how a different practices emotion socialization were at play. The emotions that we looked at for this measure were anger and sadness. And what we did was we asked the participants for both of their parents separately how they socialize these emotions. And so we asked specifically and separately for sadness and anger. But what we did is we averaged across the total score. An example of one of the items for this measure could include when I was angry or sad, my parents asked me what made me angry or sad. So that kind of just gives an example of how the items were worded on that measure. And participants responded on a scale of 1 through 5, 1 being never, and then 5 being very often.
Thank you for the detailed description of that measure. And it sounds like you had to do quite a bit of like adapting to our particular study, right? Like
Yeah.
even focusing on only these set of emotions rather than all emotions, or even the fact that we had to pick the right sort of demographics, meaning the age range to ask about, right? So not the parents and their
Yeah.
perception, but rather the college students' perception of the parents. All right. If you had to explain this study, which admittedly is very sophisticated and psychology students will be able to understand, but if you had to explain it to someone who's outside of psychology, how would you explain the significance of your study?
Yeah, I guess there's a lot of implications for a
Hmm.
study like this, but I think as far as emotion goes, even though that was insignificant, there was, or even though the both emotion variables as moderators were insignificant. In our study, we did find that higher levels of emotion regulation in a direct relationship, lead to more positive help seeking attitudes. So, taking that finding, I think it's important for people who are around Asian Americans, whether that be like family members, like teachers, counselors, higher education institutions to really recognize how important being able to have like a healthy emotion regulation strategies can be for
Hmm.
Asian Americans in terms of help seeking attitudes. There's a lot of research to show that stigma, especially among Asian Americans, that can lead to negative help seeking attitudes. So whether that be, for example, like in the counseling center to, have emotion regulation workshops or just to spread awareness around why having healthy emotion regulation can be really beneficial, especially in this age range. I think our study can kind of help point to why emotion regulation can be helpful in that way.
Mm,
And then in terms of religious coping, positive religious coping, I think it
mhm,
shows that there are religious aspects that, definitely shouldn't be separated from like psychology, mental health. It can
mm,
be used in a combination and it can really be used to help facilitate positive help seeking attitudes.
mm,
So while there is danger and it can be negative to use religion, as like the sole way of coping with stressful life events, you don't want to like exclude religion altogether and, discredit that because our study showed and like how some other studies showed it can be really beneficial. So it's important to find the balance between, religion and what, you know, psychology teaches, what counselors, the goal of counseling is, and to kind of find a fine line there. And especially for counselors to, respect, people who come in with different problems and
mm.
respect the ways that they cope with different life events and respect those as, they can be helpful to the patient participant.
Yeah, I think like you said, in my networks, there's a lot of conversations about how religion can hurt when it comes to mental health. But your study certainly highlights the other side, which is one way in which religion can be helpful, right? That it can facilitate, in some sense, the reduction of stigma if it's the right kind of religious coping.
Yeah.
I guess if you had to do the study over again, like if you could wave a magic wand and reset
Yeah.
things, what might you do differently?
Actually, I've been thinking about this a lot. A lot of the people who came by my poster and
Mm,
kind of, recognized that the emotion variables weren't significant moderators. A lot of them were asking, like, would you do the study again? Like, how would you do it differently? Because, of course, it would be so wonderful to be able to get significant results, especially since what I've, experienced and what I've heard other people, Asian Americans experience doesn't fully align with what our study found. So I feel like it would make sense to and be possible to do another study that would produce significant results.
mm,
Something maybe that I would do differently with a similar study is think about, using different measures for both emotion regulation and emotion socialization. One thing with the EAC, the emotions as a child measure, since that was looking at the individual's perception of how their parents, socialize them when they were younger, there is a possibility of, memory or reporting bias, of not being able to accurately remember what
mhm.
they experienced. So I think it would be interesting maybe to survey like parents and hopefully be able to reduce that. Something else maybe could be to increase sample size. Our final total number was 106 participants. So maybe to increase that or even to think about looking at a different population, like what would it look like if we use non-college students as participants or even like a non-US sample and maybe think about like other factors that could be at play, acculturation, for example, or even thinking about like the methods. We did a quantitative study, thinking about what could a qualitative study look like and really draw from maybe like interview data, for example, and really get at those like personal experiences, kind of like I mentioned earlier.
Yeah. Yeah. No, these are all really good thoughts. So lots of mainly methodological things to think about. I really like your point about what would it look like to look at a non-college sample, right? Because college samples in general, they tend to be perhaps more attuned to the cognitive aspect of emotion, right? And to be
Yeah.
able to tap into maybe those who might not be at that level, I think that could be an interesting study, right? Interesting variation to what you did. All right. I think it's impressive, Marcella. You did quite a bit of writing that was with other people, right? So all of the writing that you did as part of our team was done as a team. And whether it's under my mentorship, but also with other students. And so I'm curious, what was that like to be writing together? Which I think I would guess that in classes, typically that's not something that you do, right? So what was it like to do that? And were there any challenges to co-writing or writing together?
Yeah, I really appreciated the co-authorship process, especially
Mm,
on this project. I mainly worked with you, Dr. Kim, and we had a very clear way of, separating the variables. I wrote the parts on, or at least for the discussion and
mm,
introduction, I wrote the parts on the emotion variables. And then you, Dr. Kim, wrote on, religious coping, stigma, help seeking. And I think in terms of, like, the way that we divided those, I think that was very intentional and it worked out really well for us.
mm,
One being because, you have a lot of experience and with writing with those variables and past research, and I feel like you're very knowledgeable and kind of know what you're talking about there with all of those variables. And then for me, I didn't have a lot of experience with emotion, specifically, like, talking about, past experience during literature reviews or, like, writing about these scientifically, but kind of like I mentioned before, I feel like they did really align with my concentration of developmental psychology. And even though I hadn't, had a lot of experience writing with these, I really appreciated, the process of learning how to do that from start to finish. But I guess in terms of, like, co-authorship as a whole and, like, the benefits that can bring to a
mhm,
manuscript, a publication, I think it's important to, bring diverse and intersecting perspectives to psychological research and
mm,
really draw from, the knowledge that everyone has in, their different areas, their different passions. There can be, a lot of nuances with research, especially when you're looking at cultural variables and Asian Americans, especially within different Asian American cultures. So I think for a lab that specifically looks at cultural psychology, Asian
mm,
American psychology, it is really important to bring in diverse backgrounds, whether that be along Asian American ethnicities, religions, since that's one of the variables we had in our study and one of the key variables we look at in our
mm,
lab. Really important to have, diverse perspectives along all of those lines and not just along ethnic and religion, but
yeah,
everything in terms of cross-cultural research.
yeah. No, really good perspectives. And I agree with you that one huge benefit of co-authorship is to work with folks who are not only similar in certain demographics, right? But also maybe there are different perspectives based on diverse backgrounds that can really shape your work and also improve the writing that you're doing. Appreciate that perspective. I also imagine that as a college student doing this kind of writing at first, it can feel pretty scary, right? Because it's a very
Yeah.
different type of writing and you're the typical college student is not necessarily doing this kind of writing, at least not on a regular basis, right? So to be able to jump into that and overcome that sort of emotional barrier, I think is also important, right? And I think you did that really well. I'm going to combine two questions together, and that is what kinds of expectations did you have in the chem lab? Were they met? And then the other question is regarding the chem lab, what advice would you have to those who are thinking about joining the lab or who have already joined the lab and are coming after you?
Yeah. I guess with the first part of the question, talking about like expectations and if they were met, I really didn't have any prior expectations with the lab in terms of what it would be and what I would gain from it. I really joined it initially to, be able to look competitive on grad school applications or resumes, which I think it is great for that. Obviously, it could be, so much more than that. So I didn't have any expectations going in, but now kind of reflecting back on my experience after being in it for 2 years, I would consider, being a research assistant, being a part of this lab and all the work that I've done, one of, my biggest takeaways from my time as an undergrad. And, I exceeded, even though I didn't have very many expectations going in, and it exceeded, all of the expectations and all of my hopes that it could have been. A couple things that, I really took away. My main takeaways were, of course, this independent research study that we're talking about, the manuscript that we wrote and the fact that we submitted for publication. So I'm really hopeful to have a first author publication, to kind of show for my undergraduate. And then the second thing that I really took away was just being able to have the close mentorship relationship with you. I feel like that's not something that I could have gained in the same way that I have these past 2 years anywhere
Mm,
else on the campus. So that's something that I really appreciate and am really thankful for. You as a mentor really push me to, achieve all of these different things and, learn all of these research skills that I feel like will carry with me,
mm,
you know, through my higher education career and hopefully to my career after. Yeah. So with expectations,
mhm,
they are definitely exceeded. And then in terms of just like, I guess, advice for those coming in, when I was kind of thinking about this and reflecting on it, I came up with two pieces of advice that I think could be really helpful for people who are in the lab or who, are thinking about joining. I think the first piece of advice that I would suggest is, learn as much as you can. When you're in the lab, take, all of the opportunities that are presented to you and just, even though it may seem a little scary or daunting to be learning different things, especially with like research, I know like
mm,
statistics and data analysis, at least for me, those were two things that were, I didn't know
mm,
at all about them. And I really didn't have any experience. So it was definitely scary thinking about learning about those. But I still was able to kind of learn about those and be able to, do those for my project. And so
mm,
I think that really made the project and the writing even more worth it to be able to say, like, I learned everything for this project. I, did this all and I can be able to like understand it and explain these different things. And so it made it even better.
mhm,
And then I think the second piece of advice that even though, being in the lab working on all these different projects can be difficult sometimes, or even you might have like finished your credit requirements and, you
mhm,
don't need really the lab for, graduating or anything like that. I would say stick with it and, stay in the lab and, really take advantage of all the opportunities and then taking advantage of, having someone who's like a close mentor to you. I think it'll really pay off in the end. I guess in terms of like my experience being in the lab for 2 years and having done a few credits where, I don't need them to graduate last quarter and this quarter, I think that's when I really started to like recognize and be really proud of myself for all of the research related things that I did. And
right.
so sticking with the lab for me has been, a really great turnout and has done really great things for me. So I think, I guess in conclusion, just be really proud of your work and,
Mm,
relish your accomplishments and, back on it and say like, this was such a great learning experience and, you did that, did all of those things.
yeah, no, that's really good stuff, Marcella. Appreciate you sticking with it. And I think
Yes,
we, as a team in the Chem Lab, were that much better for it. So thank you for your perseverance. And you're right, you didn't need to do those extra credits, but you stuck with it and you
yeah,
hopefully saw the benefits of that. So thank you for
it
sharing.
definitely did. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else you'd like to share?
I guess the one last thing I would share is just, join research and,
Mm,
really put your heart into it. And I know I mentioned it before, but it will really pay off.
thank you, Marcella.
Thank you for listening to the Cross Cultural Psych podcast with Dr. Paul Youngbin Kim. We hope this content was meaningful. If you enjoyed the podcast, we invite you to write a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Also, let us know what you'd like to see covered in future episodes. We hope you'll join us next time.